do that?
You can share.
Okay, I will go ahead and do that. All right. I hope everyone can see my screen. We will start with a brief overview of the Internet2Net Plus program and the Cloud Storage Working Group. And then we will get into a conversation about the deprovision of accounts, and I'm being joined today by Chuck Boeheim from Cornell University, Matt Deal at North Carolina State University, and Ian Crew at UC Berkeley. And they will be talking about deprovision of accounts, the approach they're taking on their campuses. But first of all, a little bit about the Internet2Net Plus program and the Cloud Storage Working Group. We started to work with Google on an agreement for Google Workspace for Education in 2020, and we had 9 universities who helped with the service evaluation of Google Workspace for Education, and then we went into negotiations on the agreement. In the end, we had 26 universities who helped with that effort. The Net Plus agreement has been available since June of 2021. And we have a service advisory board. You can see the universities who belong to our service advisory board listed here. And in fact, Chuck, Matt, and Ian belong to our service advisory board. The current focus of the board is on various topics related to Google Workspace for Education, particularly as it relates to storage management, which is the area of focus for all of us. But also we will be starting to work in the coming months on the offering for 2024. Again, we had a presentation on the service offer that is available this year. It was the first session, in case you missed it, and we'll be starting to work on next year pretty soon here. We also have the Cloud Storage Working Group. Currently, there are about 60 universities represented on the Cloud Storage Working Group, and the group meets on a monthly basis, and we created 4 sub-working groups, Deprovision of Accounts being the first group to present today. Next week, you'll hear from the Quota Management Working Group on the Tuesday session, and then the Communications Work Group will present on April 18th, and the Data Migration Work Group will be presenting on April 20th. With that, I do want to take a moment and thank all the members of the Deprovision of the Accounts Working Group. They are listed on this slide. Also, you'll see on this slide a link to our wiki space for the Deprovision of Accounts work group, and the members of this work group can be contacted at that email address, cswg-account-deprovisioning@internet2.edu. We will go into the presentation, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A. And I will also mention that if you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and enter those in the Q&A section of the webinar. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chuck.
Hi, I'm Chuck Boeheim of Cornell University. I'd like to start by saying thank you. This is the work of many people, so I appreciate the work of everybody on the Cloud Storage Committee who provided feedback and input into this, as well as all the people at Cornell who've been on the work working group here at Cornell to make this happen. So like many of you, we didn't really do much with Google deprovisioning for years because we had plenty of storage, and there was not, and deprovisioning is a hard problem. Breaking collaborations is a hard problem. Deleting data is a hard problem. So it got deferred for a long time, much longer than it probably should have been, until Google changed the landscape, and we're going to charge for storage. We have to buy licenses. So now it's a project to reduce our storage. And at the beginning of a project like this, you really need to stop and ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish? And get your goals clearly in mind. Probably storage reductions at top of mind for a lot of you right now. You might have to reduce or manage to a certain number of licenses that you have. So you might need to be worrying about license reclamation. You might have decided that some of your previously served population aren't going to have this service any longer, like alumni. Some people are ending their service for alumni or moving them to a different domain. So if that's one of your goals, you have to plan for that. You might have been migrating to a different service entirely. So some people have either moved part of their people or all of the people off to a different competing platform. And how you approach things are going to depend on whether you're staying within the one platform and just trying to reduce or get a handle on your usage versus migrating to a different service. Meanwhile, as you're removing content, you might be removing things that people depend on. So you're going to try to avoid breaking things as much as you can, or at least give people warning and let them make plans. And you want to make sure that anything that's institutional that happened to be in people's accounts doesn't get deleted accidentally during this process. And as well, you might have some institutional retention rules or retention rules imposed by outside governing institutes. So you have to think about complying with your data retention policies as well as you do this. So starting off a project, you go through all these lists of things that you need to think about and make sure that you're meeting your goals as you do these. So let's go on to the actual nuts and bolts of getting the job done. So the first thing we did was we made a list of all the things that people have suggested on the internet, on the working groups, in various forums, about steps that they took or were contemplating taking to be building blocks of this process. And we compiled a list of all of them so that we could evaluate where they fit in this whole process. So as part of this, we made a document, a chart that's listing all of these and comparing them in some greater detail, saying what are the consequences of each of these steps and the pros and cons of doing them. So that URLs at the bottom of the page is also on the resources slide at the end, and it's listed on the Confluence page. So typically people are going to take actions to prevent access during the holding period. So if you set a user quota to 0, you probably prevented the user from logging in to begin with, but if you set their user quota to 0, then anybody who's sharing files with them can't update them any longer. They can still read them, but that gives people a clue that this file is frozen, this content is on the way out. You probably want to turn off services for the account, so those don't become an issue either. So you probably need to leave on Drive and Mail in order to manipulate the data in those two services, but most other things you're probably going to turn off. You probably need to remove the license for the user, suspend the user. one possible action is to rename the user. That's especially useful if you're using something like some external authentication like Shibboleth, because then the user ID does not match up with the Shibboleth principal any longer, and the user is effectively locked out from logging in. Renaming also changes the visible label on, if people are looking at who's owning a file, who's using a file, it becomes a different label. So that's also a clue to collaborators that this person's account is on the way out. Changing the password and revoking tokens, make sure that they don't get to log in through other means, especially revoking all those application-specific passwords that persist even when you've locked out the account. Then you can break sharing with Drive Trust rules to say, make content disappear from all the people who are sharing it without actually deleting it. So that's a way to signal to people this content is gone, and they can contact you then, and you can get it back easily. And finally, you might want to label or rename the content as you put it in this deprovisioning status to indicate to collaborators that it's content that's at risk. Some of these were in the category of warning collaborators, the rename user, and then you might actually, or adding labels to the file. And then you can encourage the users to copy or move the data or copy it to a shared drive. So once you get towards the end of your process, then you're going to want to finally delete the data, and actions that delete data include doing a deletion with GAM, using vault retention rules to delete the data, although that does not work on content that is shared. At least we'll clean up the stuff that isn't shared, and what's left over is the stuff that you have to worry about. Some people are contemplating taking all of their Drive data and moving it to a service account so that they can deal with it in a consolidated way. And then, of course, the final method is just delete the account and everything it owns goes away. So take a look at that chart, and those are the building blocks to do your own deprovisioning process. So we're going to go through 3 sample deprovisioning processes that 3 of us have are contemplating for our own universities, and point out the steps and the differences. And then after the end, we'll take some questions on how you might adapt these to your own workflows. So I'll talk about what we have planned first. So as background, we're staying with an EduPlus plan, and we're managing our storage down to about 1 petabyte level. I think we'll have about 1.2 petabytes at the end, but of course we want a little headroom to not run over all the time. So stage 1 in this, our goals are to prevent access when their affiliation changes so that they're no longer entitled to an account. We have attributes in Active Directory that list what services they're entitled to. So for us, we just read Active Directory and say, okay, you're not entitled anymore. We're going to start putting you through this process. We're going to go through multiple stages of more and more restrictive access so that people have time to notice that some things they're sharing are on their way out. And give them time to transfer or copy them or ask them ownership to be transferred. And we're going to try to signal in as many ways as possible to people who are sharing that the content's at risk so that people notice and take some action. And our final principle was to try to choose actions that are easily reversible. So you could go through, you think about going through and removing all people sharing a file, remove all the permissions from all the files in an account. That's not easily reversible because you've lost the data. Drive trust rules, on the other hand, are something that you take the sharing away and then you can put it back and restore that access. Even down to when you delete an account, you've got 20 days where you can recover the account. So at every point, we're trying to do things that are easily revertible, and so you can get back to a state. The person comes back or wants extended access to their account, you can put it back in a working state. Okay, so let's go on with the process. Stage one. We're going to be moving users to an OU that has a zero quota and everything except drive and mail turned off. We're going to rename the account to formerly dash their net ID so that that will show up in the sharing lists as the owner is a formerly person, so that's signaling people that it's at risk. Since we use shibboleth, it also prevents them from logging in. And that's a reversible action. You just rename the account back and you restore access to it. We're going to go ahead and revoke all tokens and passwords at that time so they don't have backdoor ways to get in. And at this point, we notify the manager if we have one on record. Of course, students don't typically have a manager, but if they've worked in a lab or a part-time job, and also for staff who leave who have an account, we notify their manager. So the manager has a chance to say, oh, I've got stuff, or he might have stuff that I need, or give me a list, or transfer everything. So in this case, we would use the Drive transfer service to kick off a transfer to the manager, just put the whole thing in the manager's Google Drive. Second part of stage one is that after we've given the manager a chance, 30 days and 60 days, we'll send a notification to people who are collaborators, who are sharing a particular item, a folder or a file. So we have to go through the list of items in the person's account and find out the entire list of people who are sharing it. And then use that list to drive a mailing and say, you've got content at risk. You can go take a look at this and see if you need it. We're going to suggest at first that they just make a copy, because in many cases, if it's just a few documents, that'll be the easiest thing for them to do, and avoids all the problems of ownership transfer, which in Google could be pretty extensive, because you might have a folder that contains many, many different owners. If people have those complex situations, we assume that at that point they're going to contact us, and we can do something like copy it to a shared drive and try to resolve the ownership problems. But we'd like to do that in the cases only when it's needed, so we're not going to offer that up front as their first recourse. And then on to stage two. Next slide, please.
It is showing the stage two slide for us, Chuck.
Okay.
Maybe you just have some net lag.
Yes, the challenges of rural internet. I've got deer in the yard and a 1 megabit connection. Okay, so the stage two is that we're going to move them to a different OU with the Drive trust rules enabled. And it's going to prevent them from sharing. So that's going to cause the files to disappear from everybody who's been sharing them. And I hope at that point that they notice, oh, something I was using has disappeared. And you can reverse that by moving the account back out of the OU to the stage one OU. So easily reversible, except that it doesn't automatically put the content back in the shared with me section for the collaborators. We've talked to Google, and we filed that as a bug, hoping they'll accept that as a bug and fix it. But you'll have to, at this point, if you do this, tell the collaborators it's back, but you'll have to search for it to see it again. So search for owned by and the formerly dash net ID of the user. Probably the easiest way to find it. Then they can put it back in their shared with me and take some action on it. Okay, on to stage 3. After it's been in that holding stage for like a couple of months, the account will be deleted, and then everything really goes away. And it's still recoverable for 20 days after that. So if something really is broken at that point, there's a way to get it back. This is largely modeled on a process that we've had in place for quite a few years with Box, where we go through the same roughly equivalent set of steps, phasing out the Box account and notifying collaborators. It's worked very smoothly. Box doesn't have the ownership problems that Google has, so we're going to have to discover the differences and adapt to those as we can. Okay, and then I think we're up to the next speaker, Matt Deal. So over to you, Matt.
Thanks. I'm Matt Deal. I'm from NC State University, and I'll walk you through a different process we're going to use for this. So I literally stole Chuck's slide. We have very identical goals. We want to let people know we're going to delete stuff, want to make it easy for them to find that stuff, and then hopefully not delete things too quickly, but I'm sure that'll happen somewhere. But we have reversible actions in most cases. Let's check out stage 1. Very similar. We suspend the user. We move them into an OU where there's 0 quota. All the services are off. This immediately notifies collaborators that the document or file they're trying to access is read-only. And we have settings turned on in our domain where editors can move suspended users' files into a shared drive. So our recommendation at that stage is for them to move it into a shared drive so they can maintain access. And then we'll proceed to stage 2A, where after some amount of time that is yet to be decided, we will label all the files owned by one of those suspended accounts, leaning towards a label like pending deletion, perhaps dash date, dash user classification like employee, faculty, student, something, to make it clear what type of file it was. Collaborators can then search for shared with me and that label, and they'll be able to find every file that we are planning to delete that they can see. They can take the same steps they could previously now that the files are a lot more obvious to them, and they don't have to do potentially hundreds of owner, former user, owner, former user to searches. So our recommendation for them is still to move things into shared drives. We can move to 2B. So labeling is kind of tricky. It requires temporarily assigning the account plus license. We run a script that uses the owner account to label all the files that they own. So that account gets a license. You also need access to drive and sufficient quota to manipulate the files. That's easily done by adding the account to a group that turns the drive service on and gives them a quota like a terabyte or 10 terabytes, whatever is necessary for your domain for your largest user. And then that account can go through the API and label all of the files that it owns. And then we can go to stage 3. After another undecided amount of time, we will trash all of the drive content in the account and all of the Gmail content in the account. Gives an additional 30 days of notifications. If a collaborator accesses that file, they see that it is in the owner's trash, it cannot be recovered, and at that point, all they can do is make a copy, but that option's presented to them up front. So they've missed the shared drive window. And then stage 4 we will, after another amount of time, delete the account. For example, here in North Carolina, we have to keep records for 7 years. So an account would sit in that previous stage for likely at least that long before we would delete the complete account. And that's our potential process. I'll hand it over to Ian.
Great, thanks, Matt. So at UC Berkeley, we are not nearly as far along in our decision-making process as Cornell and NC State are. We're still trying to figure out exactly which levers we're going to pull, but I thought that I would highlight a couple of things that we're pretty sure we're going to do that are maybe a little bit different, and add some stuff to the conversation. So I'll just highlight those and say where we're at. As other folks, Chuck talked about, we wanted to follow a process pretty similar to what we had been doing for Box. And one of the things we wanted there was something similar to Box's collaborations report, to sort of help us better understand how our users are using the service, and inform our strategies and decision making about, well, okay, how much data is shared and with who, and how much data will people lose access to as we start deleting accounts, that sort of a thing. So Google, unfortunately, doesn't offer a similar report. So I put together a little something in Python to generate that. And it takes a while. It's because it has to look at every file owned by every user on our Google instance. But it is sort of beta level code still. But I'd love some help to test it. And I just put the link in the chat of this meeting if you're interested in helping me test it and giving it a try. Please request access to that file and I'll add you. One thing that's a little tough about this is because of the ownership model in my drive, which is that stuff in a folder can be owned by people that aren't the owner of the folder. So you can have this really mixed up bunch of ownership. You get things where there are many, many, many more items, folders or individual files that somebody might lose access to when we remove their account. So as you can see here, for us, we have 5,000 people that'll lose access to more than 1,000 individual items, whether that's files or folders. That's something that we're going to have to think through, and maybe we take a somewhat different approach, something more along the lines of what Matt at NC State is doing. We're still sort of scratching our heads over that, quite literally. Let's see if we can go into the next slide. We skipped stage 2 because we really don't, like I said, we haven't decided yet. We have done a little bit of thinking about deleting accounts. One of the issues with the ownership model in my drive is that if you delete a folder that contains a bunch of, or if you delete a user that owns a folder that contains a bunch of stuff that's owned by other users, files or subfolders, that whole folder hierarchy essentially gets blown away in an irreversible sort of a way. It doesn't there's no way to sort of go back, really. And because of that, we got a little worried about that. And so one thing that we are thinking about doing is taking ownership of the folders that belong to people that are about to be deleted. So like literally as a step in the delete this account script, to transfer the ownership of any folders they own to a holding account. Folder objects in Google Drive are actually 0 quota, so that holding account won't actually run into quota issues. And our intent would be to have a second script that sort of went through that holding account and said, well, does this folder still have any current collaborators? If not, delete that folder because it's now safe to delete. And then potentially also communicate with the collaborators saying, hey, do you want to take ownership of this? Something like that. We're still trying to figure that out. And I don't remember if I have another slide, but no, I don't. So I guess I'll hand it back to Chuck at this point. Chuck, I can see your lips moving, but I don't hear you. I don't know if that's just me.
Chuck, we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know why that happened. So some additional considerations that we came up as a sort of a postscript are things that you have to worry about that we haven't covered yet. Vault. If you're using Vault for legal holds or other things, that interferes with your ability to do most of these actions. So you're going to have to check on your Vault status as well, and either take people off of their holds if that's appropriate, or leave them on their holds and put their accounts aside so you don't mess with their data. So worry about Vault if you're using it. Another thing to think about as you're doing this is there isn't any out-of-the-box way to do this. You're going to have to do some programming. And I know that is a hurdle for a lot of institutions. And you're going to at least need to be able to use the GAM tool. You're going to need to create some CSVs of users to take actions on and learn how to feed those to GAM and do things in bulk. Most of the things that we've been talking about actually involve heavier scripting than that, where we're using GAM or APIs directly to do these things in bulk if you want to do anything as complex as what we've been presenting here. So that's something to plan for, getting enough programming expertise available to you to undertake this project. And another thing to be aware of is there's a lot besides Mail and Drive that's in a Google account, which you may not have. You may have not turned on these services, but worry about them if you have. People's secondary calendars will go away if people are sharing a group calendar or an outage calendar or something like that. If the owner goes away, so will that calendar. Google Scholar is loved by many for citations. It also can't be moved to another account. So if somebody's leaving and they've got a Google Scholar, it's gone. You can't do anything with it. Purchases in Google Play can't be moved. They're stuck and they go away when the account goes away. Worry about if they've created any GCP projects or analytics properties. Those can generally be transferred by changing the ownerships of them. Content in YouTube or in the Google Collaboratory. And the list goes on. There's a lot of other services that can be accessed through Google, and deleting an account removes a lot of content or a lot of access. So all things that you should be thinking about as you develop your deprovisioning plans. So I think that's all that we've prepared for presentation. So we've got plenty of time to take questions and talk about it. There's our wiki and the public folder that contains our documents and the examples of our detailed provisioning plans. So avail yourselves of those. So Dana, were you going to moderate the comments?
Yes. Just turning off the presentation mode, and we will share the presentation. In fact,